The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The Daily Beast has just a blockbuster article out, which, if it's accurate, confirms what would be really the first publicly known connection between Trump staffers and associates, and not just Russians, but Russian intelligence operatives, known colloquially sometimes as Russian spies. And we're talking here about Rick Gates. Rick Gates is the business partner of former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort, both of whom have been indicted by Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller. And what the Daily Beast has learned and is reporting is that the prosecutors working for Robert Mueller have now been able to directly link Gates to a person tied to Russian intelligence. Obvious question we should all have when the Daily Beast reports this: how do we learn? How did they learn this? And the way that they learned this is because of court filings that were released a couple of days ago, which say that Gates and an unnamed person who worked for one of Paul Manafort's companies were in touch in the months leading up to the November of 2016 election. I think they specifically know even September and October, August, September, October, somewhere in that range. And they've described the connections between Gates and this individual linked to Russian intelligence as, quote, pertinent to the investigation, meaning Robert Mueller's investigation into Trump-Russia coordination, collusion, and possible criminality. The court filing, the same court filing that's the basis of this Daily Beast report, also says, and this is the key part, right, that Gates knew that this individual was connected to Russian intelligence. And if true, absolutely huge, because this is crossing the line into knowing and deliberate contact specifically for the purposes of the Donald Trump campaign with individuals in the Russian government. In this case, it's even more specific in the sense that it's Russian intelligence operatives. Now, there are people who will hear me say this, and I'll get calls from them, emails, live calls, who knows. Maybe tomorrow we'll hear from some of them who will say, David, there is simply no evidence that a crime took place, no matter what coordination there was, no matter what, quote, collusion there was. But that now is also a narrative that we have to refute, because the list of possible crimes here continues to get longer and longer the more we learn about what took place. So accepting assistance and things of value, be they money or information, as we've talked about, from foreign entities for a federal election in the United States is a crime, right? That's one possible crime that is on the list here. Covering up those incidents of receiving things of value, also a crime. Obstructing investigations into those incidents regarding the receipt of things of value from foreign entities for elections is also a crime. Lying to investigators about those incidents is a crime. And when multiple people work together to either cover up or obstruct or mislead, that can also be the crime of conspiracy. And the talking point from the Russia denialists, and there's some on the right and there's some on the left, as you probably well know at this point, is, David, collusion's not a crime. Collusion simply is not something that is a crime in the criminal code. That's sort of like saying killing people with guns isn't a crime. I can find no crime called or described as killing people with guns. Well, just because it's not in the criminal code that way doesn't mean it isn't this thing called murder, right? And that starts to become really a semantic disagreement. Colluding where the foreign entity provides things of material value is a crime. It wouldn't be called collusion, but we're speaking colloquially here about the various crimes that might be included under that umbrella. Now, also stunning is that this story barely registered yesterday in the midst of news about Trump bragging about what's going on with North Korea, Stormy Daniels, Trump missing from the public eye with absolutely nothing scheduled up until today for long periods of time, Facebook story. And even if this story did get more coverage, the committed Trumpists aren't going to care, right? They'll talk about what's going on with Donald Trump and unemployment or whatever, the same unemployment numbers that they didn't believe under President Obama. And in fact, I saw the other day on CNN, the day that CNN re-aired Anderson Cooper's 60 Minutes interview with Stormy Daniels, CNN sat down with a bunch of Trump voting women. I don't remember where it was. I think it was somewhere in the South. And it was just total cognitive dissonance, right? Some of them saying this was a long time ago. Others saying we simply don't believe it. Others saying Trump's personal life all of a sudden just isn't a concern for us because his legislative positions are Christian and close to God. So if you're waiting around, as I know there are some people waiting around, they email me, they say, David, as soon as X happens, then the Trumpists will fully abandon Trump. No, they won't. The Trumpists are ideologically and fully committed to Donald Trump. And the extent to which cognitive dissonance is going to keep them there goes well beyond another dozen accusers of sexual assault against Donald Trump, or even more connections here with Russia. So we've got to just forget about them, and we've got to do whatever we can to make sure that justice is carried out here, because they're not going to come over to the side of logic and reason. There's also another huge story breaking in the last 24 hours from the New York Times, which says that Donald Trump's now resigned personal attorney, John Dowd, discussed the possibility that Donald Trump might pardon the indicted Trump associates, Michael Flynn and Paul Manafort. There are three people familiar with these discussions that told the New York Times that the discussions were between Trump's now resigned/fired lawyer, John Dowd, and the lawyers for Michael Flynn and Paul Manafort. And this took place some time ago. And what they were discussing was, if they were to plead guilty but not to cooperate with Mueller, would Trump be willing to pardon them? And the reason that Trump's lawyer would be doing this is that Trump's interest would be that Flynn and Manafort not give Mueller information that might be used against Donald Trump, maybe say something that gets Trump in trouble. So the idea is, if Flynn and Manafort believe that Trump will pardon them, they all of a sudden have no reason to cooperate with Mueller, right? The reason to cooperate with Mueller would be if they don't believe they're going to get pardoned, and by cooperating, they might be able to get a lesser charge or a lower sentence if they are to be found guilty at some point in the future. If they know or believe that Trump is just going to pardon them, they can just say to Mueller, charge me, prosecute me, sentence me, do whatever the hell you want, because they know in the back of their minds that Donald Trump is ultimately going to pardon them. And once again, we get back to the main question, the main sort of observation we've had all along with Trump's behavior here. If you did nothing wrong, do you have your lawyer start to talk about pushing people not to cooperate on the basis of a possible pardon forthcoming? If you did nothing wrong, do you worry about what Flynn and Manafort are going to tell Mueller? Because there would be nothing to tell Mueller if you actually did nothing wrong. And this report is being denied by some Trump associates. But if you listen to the denials, listen to the language they use. They are saying things all in the present. There is no consideration being given to pardoning Flynn and Manafort. There are no discussions taking place at the White House involving Donald Trump about pardoning Flynn and Manafort. That is the present tense. That is not a denial of the fact that at the time that this allegedly took place, this is something that was being discussed. Whether Trump knew about it or not, that's sort of another question. I would presume that he did. So this is really not looking good. Yeah. Not the behavior of innocent people.
That's an unorthodox political or legal strategy, I would say.
Yeah.
But I think it could work, because if Trump just decides to pardon everyone, to pardon Michael Flynn and Paul Manafort, and maybe even go further and fire Robert Mueller, it would be big news for a couple of weeks. But given the fact that Republicans have control of the House and Senate, and there are so many committed Trumpists out there in the country, I think it would blow over.
I don't know. I mean, there are even Republicans who have said, if Mueller goes, then that's where we go to a new level. It's been people like Lindsey Graham and some others. Do they really have the power to do that unilaterally if the Republican Party at large doesn't really want to do that? I don't know. This might be completely naive of me, but I would hope that if that were to take place, that there actually would be repercussions. But you're generally pointing out something that we've seen, which is that the new scandals just replace the previous ones and we sort of forget and move on. What we do know is that last year Trump was asking White House lawyers about how far his ability to pardon goes, We know that in other meetings, Donald Trump specifically brought up the issue of pardoning Michael Flynn. And as usual, all of the roads lead us back to obstruction of justice, right? Is a promise or implication of a possible pardon in exchange for someone not cooperating with investigators, is that a form of obstructing justice? The answer is actually legally unclear. There are legal experts that are divided on this issue. Those who say that it would be obstruction say, listen, the president has pardon powers, but the president can't use the pardon power to protect himself, that would be a form of obstruction. The counter argument is this is an absolute power to pardon that the president has. The motives of the pardon, no matter whether we can prove them or are just speculating on them, wouldn't be prosecutable no matter what. So ultimately, it's going to be a legal battle that at this point we don't know which way it would go. And then the other angle is this a form of witness tampering, right? And I don't know the answer to that. It's tough to get a precedent on that, especially if Trump's lawyer is the one having these conversations. You'd have to prove that Trump was somehow involved in that, directed, or was knowledgeable of it. But the window of deniability here is closing. The desperation is clearly growing. And by the way, related, we also learned yesterday that Paul Manafort seems to be betting on a pardon from Trump at this point. There are legal sources that spoke to CBS News and straight up said Manafort's strategy looks like is going to be do not cooperate, fight all the charges through and up to and including trial, probably end up being found guilty on something, although we don't know yet what, and then count on a Trump pardon. And that's where we are. And as far as Michael Flynn is concerned, he's in a bit of a different situation. He seems to have some motivations related to protecting his son, which might make him comport himself differently than Paul Manafort. New definition of MAGA, I think, is making attorneys get attorneys. That's really what the motto is becoming here of the Trump administration. Michael Cohen's got an attorney. Trump's attorneys now are seeking counsel. Other attorneys in the administration need to be represented. And we're very quickly headed towards a constitutional crisis where the most relevant question that will help us resolve all of this might ultimately be, what are the limits of presidential power, period? Because when you look at, can the president be indicted? When you look at, can the president use pardons to protect himself? When you look at all of these questions, what they all eventually point to at their full conclusion, if this escalates, is a decision that would ultimately have to be adjudicated as to what the limits are of presidential power. Send me your thoughts. I'm on Twitter at dpakman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. And we've got a good one today. I'm glad you're with us.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Joshua Auger, and today's sustaining member of the day is Jill Johnson. Jill's been with us since 2011. Joshua Auger, not quite as long, but I do want to thank them both equally. Both new and sustaining members are doing a lot to keep the show growing, going. We talked yesterday about some of the new initiatives. I'll follow up about that later today. But in the meantime, you can sign up, join Joshua and Jill at davidpakman.com/membership. Coupon code available. Vote soon 18. This morning, I was browsing the David Pakman Show subreddit. This is a discussion forum where nearly 6,000 of our viewers and listeners are discussing politics, making suggestions for programming on the show. You can find it at davidpakman.com/reddit. A few interesting discussions that I spotted this morning. Interesting idea. Have Muslim Americans join the NRA en masse to make the organization less palatable to conservatives. I think that there is something very, very interesting there. There has always been this idea among some pro-gun fetishists that they are absolutists on the issue of gun rights up to and until brown people, black people, poor people sometimes start buying guns. And I am curious as to what the reaction would be of the hardcore white gun fetishist NRA member if a ton of Muslim Americans all of a sudden say, we want guns, we are going to start joining the NRA so that they can defend our right to own guns. I'm guessing some NRA supporters would welcome it, and others would probably not be so pleased. Also from the David Pakman Show subreddit, Dave Rubin is voting for Trump in 2020. Now that, it's sort of true. I mean, I watched the video, and it seems that what Rubin was saying is that if the alternatives are crazy progressives like Bernie or Elizabeth Warren, then his choice would be Trump in 2020. Which, listen, if true liberalism is voting for Donald Trump, I don't know what liberalism is anymore.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Only a true liberal would vote for Donald Trump.
The last liberal, and the last liberals clearly now are voting for Trump, apparently, if you follow this logic. I don't really have too much more to say about it, although, as you can see, a lot of people on our subreddit very, very eager to comment about these breaking and fascinating developments. Also from the David Pakman Show subreddit, what makes eggs organic depends on who you ask. Case in point, the definition of outdoors: covered porches or open pasture. And Donald Trump's USDA is relaxing the rules for eggs to be certified organic. Yeah, I've talked about this before, and there's a former producer, Lewis, for example, believed there was no such thing really as organic, because no matter where under what conditions you are raising livestock or growing produce or whatever, that if rain is being used to water, that it's acid rain that's contaminated with a lot of our pollution. Like, is that really organic? So he had a very absolutist position that there's no such thing as organic whatsoever. Organic does mean more than natural. Natural is a totally unregulated term. Organic at least means something, although it's true that under the USDA of Trump, the rules are being further and further relaxed as to what is organic.
Does this bother you? I know you do the cage-free thing, but...
Do I? I didn't know that.
That's what you've claimed in the past.
I do cage-free, but I don't necessarily go for the pasture-raised eggs. But listen, at this point, I don't even pretend to know what the hell is going on. And lastly, from the Reddit discussion forum, Stefan Molyneux is telling his cult to prepare for a race war. Yeah, I watched this video. It is filled with histrionic drama, and it's just, it's crazy. I don't really talk much about Stefan Molyneux on the program. I don't know that I have much to say about Stefan Molyneux, but yeah, he did a video recently that some of our viewers were discussing on the subreddit, preparing his followers for what he believes is going to be a race war, and saying you're going to need, I think he said you're going to need the guns and you should be prepping and that type of thing. Sowing panic. I mean, really.
I was lucky enough to go the first 23 years of my life without ever hearing of Stefan Molyneux. And then, like a month ago, I heard his name 3 times in one day. And that was the first time I've ever heard of him.
Yeah, well, listen, once you are exposed, there's no unringing that bell. Now that you're familiar with him, there's no way to go back on that. Join the discussion, davidpakman.com/Reddit. I'm on there. Pat is on there. A lot of good stuff happening, I'll tell you. And we've got moderators, too. No trolling allowed, to the extent that we notice it.
Some trolling.
If the trolling is subtle, it gets by the moderators, but then it's maybe not really trolling because nobody notices it. Yesterday, I told you that we have a new goal. The new goal for the expansion of the David Pakman Show is to add 500 new paid supporters. Doesn't matter if they're members, patrons, or YouTube sponsors. We want to add 500 supporters, and the reason that we want to do that is to expand the number of shows we do in a year by having an additional producer, so we can have rotating vacations and continue to do new shows during staff breaks. That would add about 25 shows a year. In addition to that, we also want to get rid of some of our advertisers from the podcast and the radio show and the TV show, and that time can be moved over to just be more time for discussing stories and politics. Those are the goals. Yesterday was the baseline, and as I mentioned, there are 3 ways to make this happen. Number 1, become a member, okay? davidpakman.com/membership. People are probably somewhat familiar with this. I mention it from time to time. Any membership, whether it's monthly or yearly, even discounted memberships using the coupon code VOTESOON18, any membership counts towards the 500 new financial supporters. The other option is to make a contribution through Patreon. Patreon contributions, which can be for as little as $1 single solitary dollar per month, also count towards our 500 new financial supporter target. And lastly, YouTube sponsorship. This is something that our YouTube channel has been invited to participate in. It is a beta program. $4.99 a month makes you a YouTube channel sponsor, bonus content, a sponsors-only badge when you participate in chat or comment, and it is done by using the blue sponsor button that you can see both on the YouTube channel homepage as well as on most YouTube videos. There is a blue text sponsor button that you can press there. So right now we are at 7. This started yesterday. The goal is 500 new supporters. We are at 7 new financial supporters, net increase from yesterday. Let's do it. My goal would be, what is my timeline? I mean, listen, it'd be great to do it in a month. Why not, right?
Sure,
If it's
yeah.
possible, it'd be great to do it in a month. I don't know how long it'll take, but if we can bring on 7 new supporters a day, we're looking at like 90 days until this is done. I would love to just get this thing done in a month and move on.
I think it can happen fast, and that's because it doesn't discriminate. We take membership, Patreon, sponsorship,
Sure.
all of the above approach.
Whatever you want. You can send coins to Pat if you want, and we'll even count that. Although it might be hard to track. I prefer you do Patreon, I guess, if you're about to mail change to us.
Bitcoin's okay.
Bitcoin, yeah, listen, if people want to contribute via crypto, just get in touch and we'll deal with that. Okay, as I teased to you earlier this week, Donald Trump has fired another cabinet member, the Secretary of the VA Veterans Affairs, David Shulkin. We saw this coming. The chaos, the turnover in Trump's staff and in the cabinet, it's off the charts. It is actually historic, quite literally. And the reported reasons for this firing are that Shulkin, in part, wasn't moving quickly enough to privatize the VA, which, by the way, would be an absolute and total disaster. It's good that Shulkin was resisting the privatization of the VA. And also, an inappropriate travel expenditure was listed, which seems to be a problem kind of epidemic proportions in Trump's cabinet. Shulkin is denying that this is a problematic use of federal funds, of taxpayer money for travel. I guess there was the idea that it was some kind of all expenses paid European vacation for him. He says, no, it was not inappropriate travel. But that's not the most ridiculous part, right? The most ridiculous part of all of this is that the replacement to Shulkin as VA secretary is going to be that doctor who flattered Trump about how healthy he was on national television. Dr. Ronnie Jackson is Donald Trump's preferred replacement to be secretary of the VA. Trump tweeting about this, I am pleased to announce that I intend to nominate highly respected Admiral Ronnie L. Jackson, MD, as the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. In the interim, the Honorable Robert Wilkie of the DOD will serve as acting secretary. I'm thankful for Dr. David Shulkin's service to our country and to our great veterans. This is the guy who said that Donald Trump weighs 239 pounds and is 6 feet 3 inches tall. Jackson has no experience as an administrator of a major department. The VA is actually one of the biggest departments or agencies that any cabinet secretary oversees. But he did say nice things about Trump publicly, which I guess now gets you a job. And Trump and Republicans have been running on the VA is a disaster under Obama. We've got to fix it. We've got to take care of our veterans. It's in shambles. This is of paramount importance. It's just horrible, terrible, and despicable. And then you bring in Ronnie Jackson to fix the problems of the massive Department of Veterans Affairs. And there is one possible glimmer of hope here. I'm skeptical about this. I actually don't think this is likely to happen. But in order to get the job, Dr. Ronnie Jackson is going to have to testify under oath, right? There's going to be a confirmation hearing for Dr. Ronnie Jackson. That is an opportunity for him to be asked about that infamous glowing review of Donald Trump's health. And I would presume that in the unlikely event that he's even asked about it, he would probably say something like, oh, HIPAA laws preclude me from answering those questions, even though the results were already made public. That's an absolutely ridiculous assertion. I would love to see him questioned about how he came up with just the amazing health report of clearly obese, clearly not 6'3", clearly not 239-pound Donald Trump. Bottom line, nepotism, cronyism, the calling card of this administration, really. I think that that's the bottom line that we're sort of getting to. And it's cartoonish that this is who's going to be potentially running the Department of the VA, but it's not really surprising. We've become accustomed to it.
Because of how the hiring process works. Either you go on Fox or Friends, or you make sure in one way or another to go on national television.
Yeah, praise Trump.
Yeah, praise Trump. I don't think it's a surprise at all.
I am reading that this may not be a shoo-in, that Dr. Ronnie Jackson actually may have real problems going through the confirmation process. And it's one of these situations where I wanted to make sure to cover the story today because this could completely blow up in his face once it becomes clear that the guy has no experience and is completely out of his league to be doing this. And we may not even see him get to confirmation hearings, as we've seen happen before, where people say, you know what, my nomination has become a distraction.
Yeah.
I'm going to remove myself from the running.
If he rescinds the nomination, I think I can be up for it. All I have
Sure.
to do is say that Trump is 6'5" and 190 pounds.
Yeah, you'll be shoot. Trump will try to appoint you by executive order and skip confirmation hearings altogether if you could give him 6'5" and 220. That I think he would love that, absolutely. Send me your thoughts about this. It's being discussed on our subreddit at davidpakman.com/reddit.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome back to the program Steve Almond, who's the author of the new book, Bad Stories, What the Hell Just Happened to Our Country. Super interesting book, Steve, and it really ties together elements of history that are connected in differing degrees to what we're sort of observing now happening in the country politically, as well as a discussion of sort of the more present day. What's sort of like the big picture of the concept of bad stories from a sort of socio-cultural perspective? What does it mean, a bad story?
Right. So I know you're deeply impressed by how sophisticated my terminology is, right? I'm not a political scientist, and I'm kind of a recovering journalist. I was a journalist sort of full-time for many years, but haven't done that for a while. I'm a short story writer and an essayist, and I think of story as kind of the central the central mechanism by which human beings construct reality. They tell stories about themselves, the world inside them and the world around them. And if those stories are good stories, if they're stories that are sort of predicated on kindness and forgiveness and the desire to be a better person, sort of both within your personal ambitions and also in a kind of general, like Christ as a figure was saying we should be kind and merciful to people. That if we tell those good stories, we end up getting good results. But the capacity to tell stories, which is what sets us apart from any other species on the planet and what allowed us to survive early, because stories were the thing that allowed us to extend the bonds of human kindness beyond just clan loyalty. We were able to believe in this beautiful fiction known as the common good, right? That we could do things that would be mutually beneficial to people we didn't even know, or that weren't part of our immediate clan or our tribe. That's a beautiful idea. That storytelling is redemptive, but there are also bad stories, which are stories that are fraudulent, that are intended to sow discord, that are intended to sort of selfishly aggregate power and wealth within a particular group. And those stories always lead to bad outcomes. When you tell a bad story, you always get a bad outcome. And the book is an effort to kind of step back from history, because I think a lot of people right now are feeling justifiably confused and distressed. And I think that's partly sort of by design. When you're part of a regime that's interested in fomenting propaganda and conspiracy theories and ginning up people's negative primal emotions, that's a lot of the game, as you know, is to keep people distressed and confused and not give them a chance to get the bigger picture. That makes them more pliant. They become objects of history who just passively consume things, maybe even just passively are distressed about things, rather than active participants in a democracy who support candidates and causes and hit the streets when they feel they're called to do so. So the book is an effort to deconstruct all the bad stories that I think really resulted in the bad outcome of the 2016 election, to step back from the hot takes and the I have a grand idea of how it all happened, because it all happened for really complicated reasons that date back well before the founding of the country. It's not like you're just going to come up with one unified theory. It's a whole bunch of things colliding.
It's interesting, the term bad stories, the stories you identify are very different than the stories that sort of the modern American right wing is identifying as problematic, but they've started to use the term narrative as an almost pejorative when trying to criticize some of the so-called bad stories or narratives that the left is pointing out as sort of the causes of some of the problems that we're experiencing. So even though the stories you identify are very, very different from the ones that the sort of modern right-wing movement has identified, the concept of the bad story or the misleading narrative, it's very present sort of across the political spectrum right now. And I wonder if there's something to that, something to the sort of realization of the background narratives and how they impact modern day politics.
Yeah, well, of course. I mean, look, one of the arguments that I'm making in the book is you got to stop looking at outcomes and results. And I think people are starting to realize that, sticking your head in the news cycle these days is like sticking your hand in a blender. It's just nothing good is going to come of it. There's too much coming at you. But if you can step back and say, okay, these bad outcomes are the result of some bad stories. So what are those stories that individual voters are telling themselves, that politicians and demagogues are telling? And, one of the central stories that we've been telling ourselves for as long as we've had a country is America's a representative democracy, right? All men were created equal. But we know that's a bad story. We know the guy who wrote those words owned slaves, owned other human beings. We know that slaves couldn't vote. We know that women couldn't vote for half the history of this country. And we know that that legacy of a minority party with deeply unpopular, but essentially plutocratic aims is always going to try to keep people from voting. We have voter suppression that's rampant. We have a whole electoral system, the Electoral College, in which somebody can, quote unquote, win the presidency by losing by 3 million votes. That was slave owner math. The whole purpose of the Electoral College was to bring slave owning states into the Union. And these are things we don't discuss a lot, but until we start to discuss them, America's not going to be a representative democracy. When when a vote in Wyoming counts 3.5 times more than a vote in California or Texas or New York, you don't have one person, one vote. You don't have a representative democracy. So some of this is a fundamental kind of reformation in the way that we think about the stories that we're told to accept. But some of it also has to do with culturally how we position ourselves. People on the right figured out a long time ago that in order to do well as a minority party, they were going to have to reach people's emotions and get them to disregard policies that were almost never in their best interest. So if you could make the debate about affordable health care a debate in which one side is telling frightened older people, you're going to face a death panel. The state is taking over your medical care. A bureaucrat is going to decide whether you live or die. In a very basic way, like a storytelling way, they've ratcheted up the stakes. And it's very convincing when you're told not just they're coming for your guns or your religion or your way of life, but they're coming for your life. That's hard to fight against when the other side is stuck saying, no, that's not true. All we want to do is make healthcare a little bit more affordable for people who don't have as much money. So there's a kind of inherent narrative advantage that the right wing has, and they have really, over the last 40 years, gone further and further towards inflaming what Richard Hofstadter, the cultural historian, calls the paranoid style in American politics. None of this
and in fact, I think that there's so many examples of that, and I've pointed this out for a long time, where on many issues, there's a coherence to the story we get from the right that is not matched by the left, not because of a failing of the left, but because reality is often much more complex. Abortion is like a really, really good example, right? Hey, listen, abortion is murder. Murder's bad. Abortion should be banned. The position on the left is not the opposite of that. It's a much more nuanced, detailed, and complex story or narrative, for lack of a better term. And when it comes to modern media, it just fails in opposition.
Well, I'll give you an even better example of climate change. The story the left is stuck telling is, hey, we've been roaring drunk on petroleum for 200 years. The planet's thermostat has gone kaplooey, and unless we radically change our convenience-based way of life, we are going to doom future generations to a horrors, an apocalyptic landscape. That's not a story anybody wants to live in. But the story on the right is, hey, a bunch of egghead scientists are running a scam and they want to make you feel guilty for driving an SUV. Do the math here. Whose story is more psychologically convincing? What's troubling is that, and this is why I write a lot in the book about the fairness doctrine, is that our fourth estate, there used to be a time where government essentially said, if you're going to use public licenses to air your radio program or your TV show. If we're going to have mass media, we need to have some some mechanism by which we regulate that so it doesn't become propaganda. And when the Fairness Doctrine disappeared in 1987, I'm sure you know this, David, the right-wing radio just rose like an absolute monolith.
Yep.
It took over the AM dial, and Fox News followed shortly after that. And what you had was essentially the beginning of for-profit demagoguery, or I shouldn't say the beginning, the acceleration of a kind of demagoguery that was now combined with the power of mass media. And you create a situation where you build the viewer or the listener with this kind of paranoid ideation where there's only one world, sort of only one way that it can be, and everybody's out to get you, especially the government. And Trump didn't have any new ideas. His ideas are completely recycled. They're really borrowed from talk radio. And he didn't really lead a movement. He just inherited an audience share that we created through our deregulation of the way that media operates. You now have media outlets that are literally paid to mangle hope every day, 24/7. They're paid to mangle hope. They're paid to frighten old people, mostly old white people who feel understandably a sense of declining utility and a kind of terror at this brown wave demographic shift in the country. And rather than preaching politics of economic uplift, of saying, hey, listen, we got some serious problems and we're only going to solve them together, the way they keep these people kind of on the drip is by saying, actually, there are a bunch of people out there. They're brown, they're Muslim, they're immigrants, they're thugs, they're in the inner city, and they're out to get you. And unless you listen to me and follow my marching orders, they're going to get you. That's incredibly powerful. And they know that. The right has been much more effective, in part, as you say, because reality is complex and nuanced. And it's also true that if you're unmoored from a functioning conscience, then you can just lie and make stuff up.
Steve, in the limited time we have left, one of the stories you talk about in the book Bad Stories is the sort of opportunity or the chance that Putin and Russia saw with Trump. Can you tell us just a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think the story we tell ourselves is, hey, the Cold War is over. 1989 came, the Berlin Wall, tear down that wall, right? The Berlin Wall came down, we all danced to crappy new wave music, and it was over. America had won. And if you're Putin, who's sitting over there in 1989 seeing this, and you grew up believing that his job was to make Russia great again, right? You're saying, it's not over, and I'm not going to beat the United States in a military sense, and I'm not going to beat them in an economic sense. In fact, we bankrupted the Soviet Union trying to do that, but I can see the weakness within their empire. They believe bad stories. They have a whole sort of, not state-run, but they have a privatized for-profit demagoguery, kind of propaganda ministry that is working over there, that is convincing people of things that are patently crazy and untrue, but emotionally very powerful. If I can tap into that, and we can find a candidate who, like me, believes that liberal democracy is something to be eliminated or at least eroded, I'm in the money. And I think it was an incredible long shot that Trump was going to be able to be nominated. But once Putin saw that, he was all in, because Trump is a kind of geopolitical unicorn. We've never had a candidate in America who actually knows nothing about governance, is completely uninterested in governing, and only wants to win the news cycle and aggrandize himself and gain more money. He's kind of like the capitalist id's perfect Manchurian candidate. And once Putin saw that, he realized that regardless of whether they colluded consciously, they were completely on the same page. They were both interested ultimately in degrading democracy, and in particular American democracy.
No question about it. The book is fascinating, Steve. We're talking about Steve Almond's book, Bad Stories, What the Hell Just Happened to Our Country. I highly recommend the book, and I really appreciate, Steve, you coming on and talking to me about it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a pleasure.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Yesterday, I was checking out Donald Trump's Twitter account, as I often do, and there was plenty of sort of weird grammar and random capitalization, very, very childish language syntax. And in the midst of all that, I saw Trump tweeting pictures of a wall and some construction equipment saying, we're starting the Mexico wall construction. And I found it sort of weird because they're only now working on getting some of the initial money to start some border wall construction. So I thought, how could it be that they're already starting construction? Like it can take days just to even get the equipment to where it needs to be. So today I looked into it in more detail, and it turns out that Trump actually tweeted pictures of previously planned repairs to existing areas of border fencing that have actually been there since the 1990s. And Donald Trump's pictures are completely misleading fabrications, but I'm sure that they're playing really, really well with his base. Trump tweeted yesterday, "Great briefing this afternoon on the start of our southern border wall." And if you look at the pictures, a number of them there, you'll see pictures of what genuinely appears to be construction of some kind of wall or fence. But it turns out that this project Trump is tweeting about started almost 10 years ago. It has nothing to do with Trump whatsoever. And in fact, some of the exact same pictures that Trump included in his tweet were tweeted weeks ago by Border Patrol in a post about the replacement of a section of a couple of miles of fence that was already predetermined that it would take place. And what's more, there hasn't even been a decision made yet as to what the new wall will look like, as well as if and when construction will start, which it hasn't yet. It's another day and it's another lie. And the theme that we're seeing is the belligerence of the lies going up, right? Whole cloth concocted lies. Yesterday, Sarah Huckabee Sanders on the citizenship questions on the census issue, saying, other than 2010, we've had a question about citizenship on every census since 1965. Whole cloth fabrications. Trump just tweeting pictures of something that's completely unrelated to his Mexico border wall. And I think that this is a good opportunity to take this even further. The new conversation about the wall is how much money will be made available for it. Will the military pay for it, right? That's a new idea that Donald Trump has come up with. When will we be able to start construction on it? This is providing cover for the premise and promise that's been long forgotten that Mexico was going to pay for the wall, right? Donald Trump throughout the campaign said Mexico is going to pay for the wall. That I promise you. Who's even talking about that anymore? Nobody, because it was a lie from the beginning. It was never going to happen. And it's the last thing that right-wingers want to talk about. And if you force them to talk about it, they'll say, well, it's the fault of Democrats or Mexicans or whoever, that it's not going to happen. If it were up to Trump, it would. But that's the whole point. A lot of things that if they were up to the candidate would happen. If it were up to Bernie, we'd have Medicare for all. That doesn't mean that just promising it with no plan is something we should excuse, because if it were unilaterally up to them, it would happen. And I was thinking about this and I wondered, is it possible that someone, maybe to keep Trump from becoming irate, we know he gets a twice a day propaganda good news file. Is it possible someone came to Trump with these pictures and said, look, Mr. Trump, they're building the wall, and Trump has been tricked into thinking that this is the wall? I don't know. I saw an interesting analogy on Reddit. A lot of us growing up, if you had Nintendo, your little brother or sister wanted to play. And maybe it wasn't a two-player game or you didn't want to be bothered. So you would hand them a controller that wasn't plugged into anything, and they would just be happy because they thought that they were playing. Is the equivalent being done with Trump, where he was given pictures of this border fence and he genuinely thinks they're doing the thing he wants?
I don't know. I think he was actively trying to deceive his base.
You do think so?
And that's because he has to fulfill that campaign promise. When it comes to some of the other ones, like the economy is going to soar or we're going to win so much, you're going to be tired of winning. With that stuff, you can kind of like cherry pick information. When it comes to the wall, when in 2020 comes around, it's going to be, is there a wall constructed on the southern border or is there not?
Well, and it's very clear what they're going to say, which is they'll use stuff like what's happening, the replacement of fencing from 1990s that has been scheduled to be replaced for almost 10 years. They'll say that's an example of Trump achieving it if he's not able to achieve more. Lie after lie after lie. I've long held that the best way to sell guns is to threaten to take away guns or to make people think that they need guns because it's so unsafe out there in the world. Case in point, we saw record gun sales under Barack Obama. Constantly, when President Obama was in office, We were being scared by the NRA and by right-wingers and by pro-gun fetishists that the seizure of your weapons by President Obama is imminent. Now, of course, it never happened. Under Trump, we're not seeing the fear-mongering that the president is going to take your guns, and gun sales are way down. We've talked about this. The big manufacturers of firearms revising downward budget projections and revenue projections. Another really great thing for gun sales and for groups like the NRA are incidents that make people feel less safe. That's the reality. When there is a mass shooting, a mass school shooting, a terroristic incident, people feel less safe, and thus they want to go and buy guns and donate to the NRA. And we're seeing that. There's a new report from the FEC. These numbers are stunning, which shows that donations to the NRA's Political Victory Fund tripled from January to February of this year. Just under $250,000 in January, more than $750,000 in February. And of course, in February, we had the Parkland, Florida mass school shooting take place. The Center for Responsive Politics also found that the number of people contributing in the 7 days after the shooting increased 500% from the week before. Now, I'm going to be super careful here, and Pat, hold me accountable that I'm being careful here, because I don't want to suggest that school shootings are false flags with crisis actors. In fact, I vehemently reject those conspiracy theories. What I want to point out to you is that when the right says shootings could be false flags as a pretext to seize guns, we need to remember that the shootings actually sell guns, right? When we saw shootings during President Obama's presidency, we would hear fear-mongering about the seizure of guns, but no such seizure took place. There were record gun sales. So if anyone actually had the wherewithal, resources, willingness, and moral vacuity to stage these shootings, to trigger some kind of action, it would be the people looking to sell the guns that would do it. Because what we see happen after these incidents is not gun seizures, but actually gun sales. And I hope, Pat, I've been clear that I'm not saying any of these were false flags. I'm just pointing out that the motive that some point out is a wrong motive.
It's not like you're offering a false flag of your own. It's just simply debunking what we hear from Alex Jones and InfoWars and the rest of them. It's
also notable that some of the same people who, after we have a shooting or an incident, say it's too soon to make guns political, after a shooting, they immediately started donating in record numbers to the political arm of the biggest gun lobby in the country. So they say the gun safety advocates shouldn't make it political, but they're fine with making politically motivated contributions to the NRA. But I actually still remain worried that this is a losing battle for Democrats. And this is an upcoming midterm election that should be one that Democrats can crush Republicans on. And I'm worried that it's not going to be the case because of the propaganda around the left-wing gun grabbing. But that's a topic for a different day. We've got a voicemail number, 219-2-DAVID-P. One of my favorite in that it's so ridiculous, pro-gun talking points came in via voicemail. Take a listen to this.
Hey, David, this is Kevin. I live over here in Nebraska, and I support the Second Amendment, but I've seen this meme going around about how Hitler was able to round up the Jews faster is because they took everyone's guns away. What are your thoughts about that, and if it's true or not?
Yeah. Listen, I don't have an hour to go through this. I've studied this quite a bit. It's been pretty heavily debunked. The idea, first of all, it's a false premise. And in fact, there was a long period of time during which Jews were allowed to own guns in Germany. Then there became a period where there were restrictions on Jewish gun ownership of certain types of guns. But by and large, there was no major gun seizure for years and years and years during the early stages of World War II and the Holocaust and Nazi persecution of Jews. And just Google it. It's widely debunked. The idea, given the full scope of what was going on in Nazi Germany and the indifference that so many had to what was taking place. The idea that Jews with rifles and handguns, which, by the way, many of them had, were going to prevent the Holocaust from happening. It is one of the most widely debunked false notions of the pro-gun fetishists. Maybe someday we'll do a deep dive into it. It probably does warrant more investigation, but it's just simply not true. We've got a great bonus show for you today. Out of time to tell you what's on it, but it's a good one. We'll speak to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.